Well, first of all, a very warm welcome to you all this morning. Thank you for joining us for this GSF live streamed event. And a particularly warm welcome to our guest, John Micklethwait. John, it's very good to see you again. The last time we met, I think it was in New York, 6 months after Donald Trump had been elected president. And certainly quite a lot of things have happened since then, some of which we may turn on this morning. Before we get going, just a few arrangement points. We will be recording the event, and we'll make it available to anybody watching who wants it as soon as possible. Details of how to access it via our YouTube channel will be emailed to you and also posted on our website. So if you miss it on the first go, you ought to be able to get it again. Today's event is a view-only one, but at our webinar last month, I promised you a more interactive experience. I did point out that we're novices at this at our end, and we hope that it'll work. I hope to be able to take some live questions today. Please do still submit your questions in writing through the Q&A function as usual. But if the technology works and I'm able to call on you, do watch very carefully for an invitation to unmute yourself, and I will then invite you to ask a question. For those on Twitter, we'll be tweeting the event on GSF's account using the hashtag GSF Events Day with a capital E and a capital D for both those words. But turning to our speaker, I'm delighted to be hosting John Micklethwait for this very timely event. John is the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, where he oversees editorial content across all Bloomberg platforms. Before joining Bloomberg in 2015, many of you will have known him as the editor-in-chief of The Economist, a position he held from 2006, having first joined The Economist in 1987 as a finance correspondent, before becoming business editor and United States editor. He's here today to talk to us about a book that he has written with a colleague. It's called The Wake-Up Call: Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weakness of the West and How to Fix It. And yesterday was, of course, a National Day of Reflection, marking the anniversary of the start of the first lockdown in the United Kingdom. And some of you might also have seen the BBC Panorama programme on Monday evening, entitled Who Got It Right?, which looked at those countries which successfully handled the pandemic and asked why. I've got a copy, as I've shown you, of The Wake-Up Call here. It's a very slender volume, and I must say it's a very good read. It manages to combine an excellent executive summary of Western political history from the 1600s to the present day, with an astute analysis of global power shifts. We read of the rise of China, the simultaneous decline of the West, and the forces over the last half century which have brought that about, all through the lens of the coronavirus pandemic. For John and his co-author, Adrian Wooldridge, the wake-up call sounded by COVID-19 is not simply the need for better public health strategies. It is a stress test for the whole Western system of government. Many such governments, including our own here in the United Kingdom, have been found wanting in their response to the pandemic. John, in the book, you compare the performance of Asian countries during the pandemic with Britain and the West, drawing some very salutary lessons for Western governance along the way, not least that our system is worse than we thought and theirs is better. You raise a huge number of fascinating and very big questions, great political themes of democracy versus autocracy and individual liberty versus centralized control, and I hope we'll be able to cover some of those today. The book, as I say, is an excellent and compelling read. It was published in September, and it was very much a real-time analysis of events. Obviously, a lot has happened since then. We have the discovery of effective vaccines, which are now rolling out, more smoothly in some places than in others. Politically, we've seen the departure of Donald Trump, and here the Brexit trade deal is finally done. We've had a resurgence of the virus and a further 2 lockdowns in the United Kingdom since the book's publication. And many countries in Europe are now facing a 3rd wave, and we've seen the emergence of more transmissible variants. So, John, to start with, I'm going to ask you to talk to us for a few minutes, 5 minutes perhaps, about why you wrote the book when you did, what prompted you to do so, and in very broad brushstrokes, what it covers and the key messages that you want to convey. Then I'll have a conversation with you and ask some of my own questions before hopefully opening it up to the wider audience. And on that note, I reiterate to those of you watching, please do use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and please do give your name so that I can identify you and call upon you. So without further ado, John, tell us about the book, why the pandemic exposed so many fault lines in our economic and political systems, and why government matters so much. You've called good government the difference between living and dying during the pandemic. What have been the most salient lessons here, and what do you think this experience might be the wake-up call that actually instigates change? In retrospect, would you have written anything different in the last 4 or 5 months since you wrote the book?
It's a very good question. And the interesting thing about this book is, you're right, we published it in September. So we wrote it during last summer. And the basic idea of it came through quite quickly to us once the coronavirus began to spread and we began to see what was happening. And one rather interesting bit, and that you have to take a degree of modesty in this. There are many books that you look at sort of rewriting about sort of a year later. In fact, what's happened since we started writing the book in some ways has made it, I think, it's reinforced the points we wanted to make. And the two basic ones, and I should have said at the beginning, it's a great pleasure to be here, not only because of Michael, but also having seen the list of rather impressive people on this call who I'm looking forward to the questions particularly. But the two basic big themes are, firstly, as you put it, government matters. And it was the difference between living and dying. And it really made a difference. I looked at the numbers at the end of last week. In Britain, we're up around 1,900 deaths for every million people, quite close to 2,000 now. The US is above 1,600. You go to places like Germany, notwithstanding their recent surge, you're down around 900. But as you pointed out, if you go to Asia, you find a really huge drop down to numbers between 50 to 100 deaths per million people. Places like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Japan are all in that kind of zone. And the point about this is that this is a very big difference. And we can argue and come back, and you hinted at the issue of vaccination, where the Anglo-Saxon countries have done better. But the way I liken it, and this is from somebody who follows Leicester, is that it's like a football match where you're 5-0 down and then you score a couple of goals in the final moments of it. It doesn't sort of carry as much weight. The numbers of people who've died are staggering. If you compare London, Seoul, and New York, they're all cities of about the same size. London, I think, has now lost over 10,000 people. New York is around 30,000. And Seoul is, depending on how you measure it, a couple of hundred, somewhere around there. And the point about this is Seoul is actually slightly bigger than London or New York. It's a large, bustling city. You can't write this off as being something to do with community-based, authoritarian, or anything like this. This is the place that produced Parasite, has some of the biggest nightclubs in the world, has bustling streets. It invented K-pop, all these sort of areas. But by any measure, they've just run this better than we've done. And I think the real point for those of you, there are some people on the private sector in this call, is that in the private sector, if somebody was 20% better than you, you would expect to be pushed out of business. These are numbers which suggest somebody is 20 times better than you. And the point is that government, in our view, just hasn't reacted, and it comes on top of a lot of other changes that have happened. You look at the league tables for education or health, you'd find exactly the same groups of countries coming to the top. And that's really the one big underlying point of this book, is that COVID was a sort of test. It was like a surprise exam for a group of pupils. You're always going to find one or two people who outperform what you expected if you set a surprise test. So Greece did really well, actually, as a good new prime minister, knew what it was doing. Places like Singapore, by Singapore's standards, actually didn't do quite as well as they hoped. They weren't good at looking after migrants and things like that. But in general, the countries that have been top of the governmental league tables are the ones that did best. So it was the people who had done their research, knew how to run things, who did well. So that's point one, government matters. The second point has to do with one statistic in all those statistics about the number of deaths per million. Again, I said Britain up around 1900. China claims a number of 3. So if you look at all their deaths and you average it out, it's 3 people for every million. Now, I think many of us would look on that number with suspicion. I think I have more Western journalists working for me in China than anybody else. They would certainly question some bits of that. But just for the sake of argument, to allow for all that, why don't we imagine that the Chinese are hiding 9 out of 10 deaths? Well, that pushes China up to a number around 30 deaths per million. Compare that with America, which is around 1,600. That means that China has outperformed America and the superpower thing by a colossal level, 20, 30 times better. Again, I think that is not just a wake-up call to America, it's a wake-up call to the world, because it is a return in some ways to the world when, as you pointed out, we do go through political history. Back in 1600, when Thomas Hobbes was writing Leviathan, China was the world's most powerful country. We overtook it, as one of the theses of this book, because we were better at government. When the Chinese invented gunpowder, they used it for fireworks. We used it to try and blow the French out of the water, and the French used it to try and blow us out of the water. There was competitive government in Europe and then in the West. And to cut a very long story short, by the 1960s, you had a complete reversal with millions of Chinese dying of starvation, while the West, America in this case, was dreaming of putting a man on the moon. But ever since then, a new tradition of smaller, better government has begun in Asia, began in Singapore. And unlike in the private sector, where you look back and see what happened with Japanese cars, they also invented smaller, cheaper, more efficient cars, and they took over vast parts of the Western car industry. But people fought back, people copied lean production and so on. Well, exactly the same thing has happened with government. The numbers for places like Japan and places like Singapore, when it comes to health and education, all these things, they are pioneering a new system. The difference is that we are not copying it, or we have not copied it really at all. And the Asian countries are beginning to do it. So you look at those league tables, and China, even though, again, it cheats, is beginning to do really quite well at some of the education league tables, beginning to push itself up the health thing, simply because they're concentrating on it. So the point of this book was to say, we do think that democracy matters. We think the West still holds most of the stronger cards, but just as before in history, this is a plague that is a wake-up call to tell us to take government seriously again. Because it doesn't matter how good your private sector is. Both Adrian and I come from the Economist school. We come from the school of believing in the private sector, believing in the power and ingenuity that lies there, some of which you can see in the vaccines. But in the end, if you have a useless government, you're going to end up with massive underperformance. And the world has watched, and they have seen America underperforming, Britain underperforming, certainly until the vaccines. And the worry is that other people will draw the wrong lessons from this. But the message is, wake up. This is not a battle that we've lost, but unless we actually do something about it, we will do. Does that give you
thank you. That's a fascinating opening summary. 2 points come to me. One is Jeremy Farrar recently said, of the Wellcome Trust, said, I think on Bloomberg, in fact, science will end the pandemic, but the exit strategy needs work. And I think that's probably a good summary of roughly where we are at the moment. And as part of that, the vaccines, of which we're all rightly proud of having developed them so quickly, are not being distributed equitably. And the Director General of the WHO said recently that the inequitable distribution was not just a moral outrage, but also economically and epidemiologically self-defeating. And he called the gap between rich and poor countries grotesque. I can see that we're never going to resolve this unless we have a certain equitable solution on the ground, because it'll just go rumbling on and catch up with each other in due course. Where do you think we've got to on that, and where do you think we ought to be looking to now?
I think there are several things in that. I think, firstly, it is true that the scientists have been phenomenal, and the ability to come up with a vaccine in the amount of time they've done has been really impressive. And there have also, just to be clear, there have been public servants who've been, I think, the job that Kate Bingham has done in terms of getting the vaccines on the British side has been fantastically good. Rather obviously, the European Union has been chaos, and I think there has been a huge number of self-inflicted goals there. So even when the scientists do their job, the way that governments react to that can also be, I would stress, can have a very deleterious effect. The European Union governments began in exactly the same position as everybody else. They just did it worse, and virtually everything they've done in terms of sort of trying to rubbish the Astra one and saying it was good again and then so on, now trying to stop bits of it coming out, has been a succession of own goals to retain the footballing metaphor. That said, the other point you make about the necessity of opening up to the rest of the world, again, I think you were absolutely right. I talked the other day to the man from BioNTech who invented the vaccine with Pfizer. He is passionate about this, A, because he believes in a more equitable world in terms of more people being able to get the vaccine, but secondly, from the point of view of all our safety, because the longer that we don't vaccinate the poorer people of the world, the more time it gives for vaccines for the disease to germinate and change and come back at us. And I think there's even a slight point at the moment with the sort of Anglo-Saxon Schadenfreude about how useless things are in Europe. To some extent, it's in our interest to help what's happening in Europe, because you can see that if new variants begin to gather pace on the continent, that's not just going to ruin our summer holidays, it's also going to come back and get us. So there is a kind of this sort of idea of being in everything together is there. And one last bit I would throw into that is that one of the things that China was quite quick at, Russia as well, was to try and get their vaccines well known in the developing world. And I don't think we have done as good a job at that. And from the point of view, especially, and I suppose we'll return to this figure many times in this conversation, Joe Biden, an incoming American president, he's taken the disease more seriously than Trump, and we can talk about that. But on this issue of vaccines in the world, this is an opportunity for America to appear like a leader again by helping to get more vaccines to more parts of the world. And it's also deeply, really this time, without any questions at all, deeply in America's self-interest to do so. So I think all those things, there is a sort of virtuous circle to come out of it. But at the moment, it's not that viewable.
And one thing which interests me, we talk about why the Chinese and the Asian countries handled it so much better than we did, and seemed to be much better prepared. But why did we miss this sort of pandemic? Because we did have preparations in place, if I remember rightly, to deal with other sorts of pandemics, but not this one. What was it particularly that gave those other countries the advantage?
But I think when you look at the Asian, why the Asian countries did well, I mean, it's a bit like one of those sort of detective series where you have to sort of strip out the things. There are definitely, it was definitely an advantage in having had SARS before. That gave you some degree of preparation. There was definitely an advantage in some places having slightly more homogenous societies. Again, that counts for something. You have the authoritarian card in China, which we can come back to. You have all these different things, but the fundamental difference, the biggest difference, was simply that they reacted quicker and they did what you're supposed to do. Their governments work more efficient. In the book, we quote the head of a very large private sector American company, which you would all know well. And the man who runs that company has a lot of outlets or has a lot of things in Asia. And when COVID appeared, he was the same as everyone else. He thought, well, this looks like another sort of Chinese thing. It might spread a bit. So he admits, relatively complacent about it. But by the end of February, it was on the cover of The Economist, obviously a magazine much better run since I was last there. But it was on the COVID goes global. was on the cover of The Economist, I think, midway through February, halfway. That's still a month before we even started doing lockdowns here. We have known since time immemorial how to deal with plagues. You go back to Hobbes's time, it's exactly what they did with the Great Plague then. We didn't take any of those measures. And the point about this private sector guy is that he started looking. By mid-February, he realized he'd made a mistake. This thing was spreading, and he needed to know how to deal with it. And he found he was looking, seeing what the Asians were doing and trying to copy it. And he found absolutely sort of zero receptiveness from government things in the West, which were stuck in their world of not bothering. The whole idea of learning from other people wasn't there. So it is, yes, there were particular things, and some people have gone through some sort of genetic differences. There were various things that you could say helped the Asians a bit. And that might explain why they were, 40% better than us, 50%, but not 40 or 50 times better. And that's to do with running things correctly and knowing what to do. And just simply having governments in which there is a degree of trust, but also there's a degree of efficiency. And I used Seoul before. Seoul was run by a mayor who then, about 9 months ago, sadly had a political scandal and left. But it was, Seoul is a very lively, complicated democracy, but they did have this system that government matters. They put some attention into it. They knew how to direct things. And that is the big difference at the moment, which comes shining through.
Slight corollary. I've had a question in from Richard Molyneux, who says, I read that diet and basic health is better in Asia. In the United Kingdom and the US, obesity and lack of exercise encourage the virus. What do you think about that?
Again, true. There are all these, we are it's like Boris Johnson's excuses about liberty. These are all true. Give yourself a few percentage points for this or that or whatever. But in the end, just face up to the fact we were useless at this. You can come with all the excuses you want, but if you go into lockdown as late as we did, if you end up with the test, the initial thing with testing, here is somewhere where Germany did quite well. We had, in America and Britain, you have two dramatically different versions of how to mess it up. And in America, you have all the problems of not having a kind of public health system, especially having a health system designed to look after the old and the rich, which obviously doesn't apply to anyone on this call that is there. In Britain, you had exactly the opposite. You had a health system that wanted to control everything. So when the first thing through, the basic lessons were test, trace, and go to lockdown. We went into lockdown late. We didn't test at all because one problem was the NHS wanted to grab control of everything rather than using private laboratories like the Germans did and other people. And so it was a succession of sort of mistakes along those lines. So yes, again, there are various things that help explain part of this picture, but not the levels of difference. And you can see what happens when you do get people who are able to run things relatively well. We saw that with the vaccines. We have seen a kind of, a slight re-emergence of Western government in those respects. But, look at the numbers. The numbers are so unbelievably different. And the rest of the world has seen this. If you imagine you live in one of those countries, emerging countries, you've seen China, which admittedly had that, they had the awful Wuhan. China did not behave well there, but they locked it down quite quickly, and very few people there have died. Now switch to New York, and you see pictures of nurses wearing bin bags because they haven't got enough protective equipment, and people being sort of buried in piles. It's that is not something that leads you to think that the West knows what it's doing.
I now had a message to David Manning. Are you now more optimistic than when you wrote the book? Do you think that Trump's inept response to the COVID pandemic has been instrumental in bringing a Biden administration to power that does indeed understand the need to wake up? The US vaccination program has proceeded at pace. The US Recovery Act is promoting growth and supporting the less well-off, and the new administration seems very aware of the need to rebuild trust in the democratic system and reassert the principles that underpin it.
Very good question, and entirely right. The answer is a bit, and very obviously Trump contributed towards America's failure to deal with COVID. He was particularly disastrous, I think, in terms, I think it's a world that David knows well. America was particularly useless in terms of either uniting the country or, for that matter, uniting the West or indeed the world. This was the very first kind of really big geopolitical global crisis in which America did not play a kind of leading role in terms of dealing with it. So Trump was not great. I mean, a terrible advice about injecting yourself with disinfectant and all that sort of stuff. But you look at what's wrong with American government. The fundamental problem, it's not that difficult to detect. The fundamental problem with the virus was that, as I said, the healthcare system was not set up to deal with it. It was set up to deal with looking after the old and the rich. And so when you had a pandemic breaking loose in America, that was always going to cause far more problems. And you look at most of the things that are wrong with American government. I mean, I'll give you a couple of other examples. Everyone thinks, and I think we can all agree, Trump's response to George Floyd was lousy. But don't forget, I covered the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles 30 years ago. America has had racist policing for 30 years and nobody's dealt with it. So that isn't something you can blame on Trump. You can certainly say he hasn't done much to help it. Look at those education league tables that I talked about. America's been at the bottom of those for years. Trump didn't do anything to help American education. He certainly didn't make it worse. Dysfunctional democracy, that's been going on for a very long time before. So all these things, yes, Trump didn't help, but merely replacing him does not kind of answer the question. Is that underneath this all, America, and we have a lot of examples throughout this book, has fallen well behind. You have the most advanced private sector technology. One reason why the health system did not cope well with COVID is that I think 50% of its systems are legacy systems, i.e. too old to be updated. You look at the people working in the IT department of the federal government and spread out across different parts of the federal government. I think there are 5 times more people over 60 than under 30. You just have a sense of no connection, I think, beneath it between the elite, and I'd love to come back to the subject, between the sort of people who go to Harvard and Princeton and things, and the federal government. Back in the 1960s, when I said America was miles ahead of China, that was a time when the elites had a very close relationship with government. They don't, and I think you could argue that on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly in America. But from Biden coming in, yes, he helps by being slightly saner and more rational than Trump. He definitely allows, on the international stage, he has an opportunity to unite allies, I think, behind America in a way that Trump, you could argue, analysed the problem, if I can use that word about Trump, relatively well, is that he saw China as a strategic rival. But his sort of answer to sort of battling China was to ignore all the lessons of the Cold War, which again, many people in this call know better than me. But there were 2 really simple ones. One is, America wins this with allies. Well, if you have a message of America first, that doesn't bring them in. And secondly, America has to sing some song of democracy and freedom. Well, again, America first doesn't work in that way. Coddling up to dictators doesn't work in that way. And Biden is beginning, I think you've seen it a bit with the things with the Quad and so on. If Biden can reunite the West, you take Europe and America together, they are stronger than China, definitely. You could have arguments about whether China is stronger than America. I happen to think not. You could have arguments about whether China is stronger than Europe. I think probably yes. But together, America and Europe are miles ahead. And once you begin to add in the democracies of Asia, you begin to have a much more potent thing. So that is an area where Biden can do stuff. But unless he fixes his own house in terms of government, there are deep structural problems in American government. And on the Republican side, you have this problem that the answer to everything is less government, which if you want, you might as well go to the Congo or you could go to New York during COVID. You discover what less government is really like. It's not a very pretty sight. The alternative on the Democratic side is, and this is where Biden's set of problems are, is far too greater kind of a unison, especially with the public sector unions. So you can look and already see what's happening in terms of education in America. American schools are falling behind. But Biden has almost immediately said that his first thing is that he won't do much about the teachers. Well, that is where Asia is moving ahead. So unless Biden does stuff on that, then most of the other things won't matter so much. So I suppose the general, a rather short, you might argue too long, but a rather short answer to David's question is yes, Biden will change some things, but the fundamental bits of American government that don't work, there's not that many signs of him knowing that that matters. But the bit where he can make a difference, I think, is on the global stage. There is one very last thing to say on that. You look at the history of governmental reform, the biggest spur to do that has been competition between countries. And if America is beginning to wake up to what's happening in China, that is one of the things that would lead you to believe that in the end it will do something about the fact that its public sector is so far behind.
I've now got, I hope, Tony Brenton, who's going to try and ask us a question.
Am I audible?
Tony?
Am I audible? Can you hear me?
You are, yes, indeed.
Okay, very good. Thanks very much. Actually, I have two questions. I thought of a second one. It's the one you've got. The one you've got, anyway, is a question about the quality of the statistics upon which you base your conclusions. Everybody's assuming that all the national numbers are more or less commensurable. But actually, if you believe them, then the UK has had more deaths than all of Africa. Plainly wrong, actually. If you just look at the excess death rate comparison between the UK and South Africa, it's plainly wrong. So my first question is, to what extent are your conclusions affected by the obvious deficiencies in the statistics on which you're working? My second question just comes back to the point that you made a couple of points. You know, the Lowy Institute has done a big survey of the effect of government on our responses to the climate, the virus. They have concluded that it doesn't make a lot of difference whether you're a democracy or an authoritarian government. I'd be interested in your comments on that.
On the first one, on the numbers, I mean, again, the numbers, it's, yes, there are slightly different ways. You're absolutely right. There are some weirdnesses. The Africa one is probable. The Africa one, I think, is explicable just by the fact there isn't as much kind of data collected. One of the more frightening things about the British number is that if you look at the excess deaths over the normal, it's even higher than the numbers that we published. The reason why we went for deaths per million is because it's sort of close to being it's the one thing which people on the whole tend to be at least reasonably accurate about. So imagine that you're right, and the British numbers are wrong by 10%, and the American numbers are wrong by 10% in a way that favours them. German numbers are 10%, and so on and so on. The levels of difference are so gigantic. Go back to my China number. I gave you the possibility that the Chinese were hiding 9 out of 10 deaths, which none of my correspondents think are likely. And I don't think even China's worst critics think on that. That still puts them, I think, by my maths, at 50 times better than America. There is this attempt, I think, to try and say, well, look, the statistics are slightly questionable. The answer is yes. They're around each one you could have little asterisks and so on, but the levels are so unbelievably different, and people can see it with their own eyes. That we have lost huge numbers of people. Go back to and some individual countries, yes, I agree. Some of the numbers to do with Africa, a few of the numbers to do with India I've seen are a little bit strange. But in general, it's one of those things where if you make a generalization, it's pretty extreme. It's not like we're shaving, it would make a big difference. Under any normal thing, I think it's well beyond the bounds of probability. And we're talking in this case about many times what one person's done, rather than just percentages better. So that would be the statistics. In terms of democracy versus authoritarian, I think that is one of the great dangers of this. I think there is a danger of a false positive coming out of this. And the basic false positive is you look at it and the world's leading totalitarian regime has done better than the world's leading democracy. So in other words, as I said, China, depending how you measure it, 20, 30, 40, 50 times better than America. And the danger from that is that people read the lesson that authoritarian behavior has helped on this. several things like that. First, you look at other authoritarian regimes, they haven't been great. You wouldn't want to be in any of the stans and get COVID. Certainly wouldn't want to be in Russia, wouldn't want to be in Iran, and I don't think anybody would want to be in North Korea and get COVID. Most of the countries have done well. You mentioned the Asian ones, big down New Zealand, Australia, all these ones. They're democracies. So in general, yes, China has done well, depending on how you believe the numbers. But the rest of, on the whole, it's been democracies that have done better. And the interesting point about, I think, most of the things that we do when we deal with COVID is they're pretty compatible with democracy. And they're but that I don't see them as a problem in that way. Democracies have always had this record of sometimes introducing unusual measures when a disease, a plague comes around. Back in Hobbes's time, you were only allowed out if you carried a white stick with you. So these things happen, but then we withdraw them and get on with things. And again, I think that is another kind of Boris Johnson excuse to start talking about liberty and so on. It really isn't about that. It's about efficiency. And it, very strangely, he isn't talking about that when it comes to vaccines.
Thank you. I've now got Kieran Devane on the line, I hope. Kieran?
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Just a question, if I may. It was the NHS which was saying, "Oh, we must centralise everything. We must do things in NHS land." My question is it really a capability of central government versus local government? Because public health would say it's really around the capability of local public health teams, local admin strength, local government, and being able to do that. So I would question really whether it's the structure of government which matters more than the structure of, say, the public health system.
Again, a good question. In general, if you look at, I'll step back a bit. In our book, what we do is that we invent we look at this, we look at the problems, we talk about the history of government, we talk about the way that the West got ahead, we look at COVID as this kind of test, and then we ask, what should the West do to reform government? And we invent a character, and we look at the job of being president of the United States. We chose the United States because it was the one which we thought most people would understand and know. And various people have pointed out to us we should have combined Angela Merkel with Jacinda Ardern, and then we've drawn the female excellence of leaders, because on the whole, women have done better at this than men. But what we did was we pulled two characters from the 19th century. We pulled William Gladstone from this country, the four-times Liberal Prime Minister, and we pulled Abraham Lincoln from America, and we combined them together into a figure called Bill Lincoln, which, yes, it's a bit of a gimmick, but we said this would be the man who'd have the job of running America and running the American government more efficiently and making the American government better. And the one limitation we put on him was the same as you would if you put somebody into any other job. We said you can only kind of borrow, you can only use what other countries are already doing. So when we looked at healthcare from an American perspective, we said we thought it did need to be a much bigger public system. And we suggested he drew on Germany and on Singapore and on Canada as places to pull on. We looked at the issue of of how government spends its money. And I think the reason why we chose Lincoln and Gladstone is because they were reformers. They were reformers who believed passionately in two things. One, on the whole, you want to keep government as small as possible. They didn't love big government. Gladstone used to run around sort of stopping people using excess writing paper and things like that. But secondly, they had a total hatred of money being directed towards the well-off. So they would have, I think, probably not liked the idea that Michael or Mick Jagger get free bus passes and I will get one too. They would probably object to that. They would have similarly, let alone Bruce Springsteen and Warren Buffett. In America has a tax code with $1.6 trillion worth of exceptions, virtually all of which go to the well-off. 9 out of 10 Americans have to use an accountant to do their taxing. This is the sort of thing that someone like Gladstone would just have ripped up on the thread and just applied taxes directly. So we do have a set of solutions, and quite a lot of them also revolve around the idea of things like non-military national service and trying to reunite, especially the elites, but just generally people to their sense of government. But on this precise question about health systems, one of the things, and regional government, one of the things we look at is, in general, especially in America, the better bits of government tend to be happening in cities. Full disclosure, I work for a man who used to be a mayor. But that's the bit of government which seems to be working, because mayors have some degree of responsibility over what they do and hang on to it. The states used to be the laboratories of government in America, they no longer are. If you look at Britain, I think one of the huge mistakes, was to over-centralise. That was one of Margaret Thatcher's big problems, obviously caused by her distrust and dislike of people, of some left-wing councils. But that is something which I think has plagued Britain. It's true, centralisation is helping the NHS quite well with vaccines, but in general, I think, yes, I would lean towards greater regional autonomy. So there are structural areas there. In general, people can relate to government. You want to have government at level. Government is no different to running a company in this way. You want to have it at levels where it makes sense and where people can understand it, and where you can actually say, look, you are responsible for X or responsible for Y. And I think, yes, we have tended to end up with a much greater kind of over-centralised thing, and we're paying the cost for it.
Can I just come in there? Because you were mentioning your boss ran a city, which was obviously New York. But at the beginning of the pandemic, New York's record was not very good in how it dealt with it, was it?
No, it was terrible. I agree. And that's another point on the Trump one, is that there are so many Americans you talk to where you sort of say, look, you've got severe problems with your government, and they come back and say, well, it's all to do with Trump. Well, New York was a Democratic mayor, you had a Democratic governor, and they spent a lot of their time feuding over individual things. So yes, on that I agree. On the pandemic, New York was not particularly good. I think a lot of that went back to the underlying health system. On other things, New York has done better. Obviously, it was run by a genius, and now it's not run by one as much. But in general, as a general point, I think when you look at the better bits of American government, you look at cities.
I've got another call come in from Mary Dejewski. Mary?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can, yes, thank you.
Excellent. Yes, I mean, I'm as seduced by South Korea and by Seoul as you are. But I just wonder whether there aren't measures that Seoul in particular has taken that would simply not be acceptable in London. However much you talk about the British way and Boris Johnson on liberty, it seems to me there are two respects that things that were done in Seoul really would have been difficult in London. One of them is the way that people's movements and contacts were tracked, which was hugely intrusive. And I'm just not sure how well that could have been enforced. And the second thing is that if only those people who were infected and their contacts had been locked down, this would have very conspicuously, disproportionately affected certain areas and certain ethnic groups, and that could very quickly have led to stigmatization. You mentioned homogeneity. London is the complete opposite of that, and I'm just not sure how that would have worked. Thank you.
Very good questions, and again, that's a totally reasonable point to make about the South Korean example. They did do some things. I think the second is somewhat a consequence of the first, because they were able to test people quicker. You did get sort of zones of high infection exposed quite quicker, and maybe that would have caused us some problems here. I don't think so, though. Actually, looking back over I think in general, when you're dealing with disease and things, people are relatively straightforward about the desire not to catch it. But, I would point out that we all surrendered. If you were Hobbes looking at the kind of freedoms, we all surrendered quite willingly, without the slightest sort of real protest. We all agreed to stay at home, not go to work, do endless things. The government intervened in lots of different ways, and we never really sort of. I think everyone in the West was prepared to accept restraints on their liberties, as long as they thought they were temporary. And it's really in the autocracies, maybe India a bit, where you worry that people grabbed powers that they may be unwilling to give back. In the case of the things they did in terms of kind of testing and tracing, yes, you're right. They pushed. The South Koreans probably were more aggressive, but again, a lot of this is just to do with state capacity. There's a rather nice example. This is from China, not from South Korea, but one of the examples we came across is that on the Chinese subway cars, they have this thing in Shanghai where as you go in, you show your phone, and the phone would then record whether you were in a subway car with someone, and then they could trace you immediately afterwards to find out if you shared it, someone had COVID. Few sort of massive civil liberties problems, and how terrible. And as a journalist, that is an issue for us because we have problems with how you meet sources if governments can track you, but that is a problem around the world. So yes, there are civil liberties, but the underlying problem is the total lack of technology. Some of the things the South Koreans did, we just can't do because our technology is so lousy. The New York subway, the sort of things that the Chinese were doing, the Shanghai subway, so hang civil liberties. New York has only just introduced sort of ticketless transport. The idea that you could have things saying what happened in every subway car is so far beyond the level of investment in infrastructure. You look at everything to do with smart infrastructure in cities. It's not really to do with civil liberties. It's to do with capacity. We just haven't put the money in the first place. So yes, you're right. There was some degree of, again, it's at the margin. It certainly helped the South Koreans. They could do things like that. Some people also mentioned the fact that they were much stricter on people coming into the country than we were. That again is true. But the underlying problem was that we had crap systems anyway, so there wasn't really an issue with that. But you're right to point out there was a difference.
Thank you. I've now got a question come in from Callum Hurst. If we can get through to him. Callum, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hear you clearly, yes. Good.
Excellent. So first of all, thank you for that. I think the statistics that you've quoted are quite powerful. I think what I'm not entirely yet convinced of is the leap that you've made from sort of poor pandemic handling being necessarily sort of a result of poor governance. I think particularly given that the examples you quote in Asia also don't just have the governance that you described, but they also have experience of recent pandemic handling. So I'm thinking in particular, H1N1, SARS, etc. I mean, one, do you think that conclusion is justified or should be caveated? And then two, actually, I do accept the point that you made that, we know how to handle pandemics, but I would sort of question whether there's a difference between the distant and recent past. And then finally, if you do disagree with that, would you say that we as Britain are more likely to handle a future pandemic differently?
Several things. Number one, the point of pointing out things. I mean, just look at the school league tables. I mean, you see what your job is. You have to assume that occasionally people in government look across. I mean, places like Singapore and the Asian countries and some of the Nordics have been doing better than us for years. These are not, you can argue about the pandemic. But the interesting thing about the pandemic is it picks up on other bits to do with government. The league table, if you and I had to write down a list of places that were well-run governments, and then you run down the list of people who do pandemics, there is that is where the greatest correlation has come. And it's really a different mentality. You look at what the Singaporeans did, and I'll just feature two things. A lot of it is just simply, it's not to do with the fancy technology and stuff like that Mary was talking about. It's underlying really to do with the people. If you work in the Singaporean civil service, you can get paid over $1 million a year. Nobody, nobody in America would dream of paying public servants that kind of money. In fact, it's $2 million in Singapore. And the reason why is the Singaporeans set out to get their elites into public sectors, and they wanted to be competitive with it. But the flip side of that is if you're no good, you're out. So Singaporean teachers who aren't good, it doesn't matter how senior you are, out you go. And that is where the education unions come in on the other side. And so I think it is a way, the Lee Kuan Yew thing, and there were lots of pluses and minuses about Lee Kuan Yew, but his idea was simple, was he wanted this to be run in the same way as the private sector is. And it does end up with better results. Yes, in some cases it's a bit more elitist than we might particularly like in other, but fundamentally in the end, it's about saying to people, and again, there are many, and there are a lot of people on this call who fit in this category, there are many very talented people who go and work in the public sector and do amazing jobs. And as I should have said earlier, there are people in the NHS who do jobs on a completely outstanding, brave level that people like me have never done. But by most measures, you look at the gap between where people leave our elite universities and where they go and work, the sort of salaries you can now get at Google or Goldman Sachs or whatever are out of all proportion to what you get in the public sector. And if you start rethinking that divide, I think almost to the people on the call, I would say that is the most important thing. It stands out again and again. Is the link between sort of the idea of public service, and again, including Michael, there are a lot of people on this call who have a much more outstanding record of public service than me. But as a society, I think that is probably the single sort of biggest thing. And if you were Gladstone or Lincoln coming back, that is what you would desperately want to reinstill. In America, the numbers are really interesting. Go back to the 60s, 75% of people trusted their government back then. But that was also a time when the best and the brightest went to Washington, and where that was seen as sort of part of what you did and part of the way it worked. And that was the last time, I think, really in America, where a career in the public sector versus the private sector was sort of broadly compatible. Sure, you do get paid some more in the private sector, and entrepreneurialism has always been rewarded, but it wasn't the same kind of difference you see now. And we've ended up in a terrible system where the right hates the idea. It has this rather lazy answer, which is sort of faux Reaganism, that the only answer to government is to make it ever smaller, and the left is unwilling to reform. And until that is really gathered hold of, I think it's going to be very difficult, unless you can actually get young people to go into government and to embrace it and get things done there. You're always going to end up with old technology. If it was back to the 60s where people happily went into the federal government and worked for it, you wouldn't end up with the tech departments being staffed by really old people. And I think we have that there is an issue there. And one of the things our fictional president calls for is reintroducing the idea of non-military service and that public service, or military as well, as if you want. And we quote a British spy, who some of you presumably would know, who gives the example of his children. He was just young enough to do some version of national service, I think. But he points out that his children are much smarter than he is, much more intelligent, much more tolerant than he is. They've seen more of the world than he ever did, etc., etc. But their only connection with working class children is when they deliver their internet shopping to them. And him, by contrast, had done something where he shared trenches with people, he did things. And we need to have some degree of re-emergence of that. If you look at there's a new biography of Jack Kennedy. You read that, and that comes through incredibly strong, that whatever his many other peccadillos, that was sort of ridden into him. And it's an emotion, it's a vibe we've lost, that I think we need to recover in some way. Sorry, so I've drifted off the original question, which wasn't an attempt. So.
No, it's very interesting, this. I mean, one of the things behind all this is the idea that once it's all over and we have our inquiries, there is then going to be a reform of some sort. And what you're talking about are elements that reform might take. But what worries me is that unless we have some plan as to how we're going to operate that reform, it'll just fall on stony ground.
Yes, and actually you could, I mean, in America, I set out the structural problems with reform, because I said there's a really big problem. The Democrats, as a party of reform in the public sector, you need some degree of a sort of almost sort of sister soldier moment where Biden, and you could argue he's missed it already with the teachers' unions, where he sort of sat down in front of them. you need to have something like that. In Britain, I think we do have. It would be, I think, entirely reasonable to have an inquiry into why we lost more people than anybody else. And people can. I think actually Belgium is worse than we are, but you can measure it by various things. But our government did some things very well, the vaccines most recently, but in other ways it has been failing us. And I think it's not unreasonable to look at that and to ask some structural questions about what exactly we should and should not do as a consequence of that. And as I've said, I think that giving more power to regions and things and giving people more connection, I think that does matter. There'll be others on this call who disagree with that, but at least part of it is looking at what people can do. It's worth, again, what's interesting, we wrote the first part of this book, or began to think about writing it, when everyone was gathered together trying to fight this thing. And the British were obviously making mistakes, more mistakes than other people, but there was still a degree of unison around it. And then you had that miserable Dominic Cummings escapade, and you saw sort of public trust or public cohesion begin to fall to bits. So, what individual politicians and political figures do matters. But I think there does need to be some degree of Gladstonian sort of rethink about what exactly we do with our government, where it's based, how we spend the money, etc., etc. And I would say to people is that some people, and I think you've got a tone of it in the questions a bit, is well, these things are never going to change. Well, three things to that. One, whenever you've had competitive threat, technology, new ideas, you tended to have something dramatic happen. I was one of those people who the arrival of Margaret Thatcher, I remember for another book describing having a sauna in California with a weird man called Milton when I was an aged 19-year-old student who told me how Margaret Thatcher was going to change the world in various ways and unleash this thing called privatization and take on the unions. And I thought he was absolutely demented. And I went to go and watch The Grateful Dead later that week as a gap year student in San Francisco. I thought this was weirder than this man Milton. The man Milton was Milton Friedman. And Margaret Thatcher managed to do a great deal of things. Our country, whatever its strengths and weaknesses, and Brexit arguably articulates both those things, our country is probably the place which has been, over the course of history, has been the place which has been best at going through revolutions in government. Most of them were invented to some extent here. So I think we can do it. And God knows there is now the technology, there is now the spur through a mixture of the disaster of COVID, seeing what we did do quite well on vaccines, plus Brexit. These are all reasons for us to look at this again. So I think in a strange way, Britain is more poised to look at this than some other places.
Thank you, John. I'm going to have to cut you off because sadly, at the end of a very interesting session, we've come to the end of our time. There are many other questions I'd like to have asked, and maybe we'll get another opportunity to do that. But thank you so much for coming and taking part today and giving us such a stimulating session. I'm hoping there'll be a sequel to your book and that it'll answer a lot of the unanswered questions so far, and that we'll then be able to persuade you to come back on again and give us your views on that. But thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the questions particularly.